So now we'll spend a little bit of time talking about just some basic disability history and culture. And as you can imagine, we're going to be talking about some laws. So it won't be the biggest overview, but we'll be talking a little bit just about the history of rehabilitation and disability-related legislation in the United States. And one of the most important things to note is that oftentimes when it came to serving people with disabilities, the way people got behind it in the United States was by the idea of helping soldiers, right? So this Smith-Fest Act, um, it passed around the conclusion of World War I, right? So a lot of American soldiers were coming back home, having acquired different disabilities, and the country decided that it was important to help these soldiers reintegrate into society and their communities and help them gain employment, which makes a lot of sense. And this kind of marked the beginning of like the modern vocational rehabilitation system in the United States. And it really changed this idea of disability as like a moral issue or a medical issue into something that was more like a social and economic one. There's also the Social Security Act of 1935, right? So that idea of the Social Security benefits for people living with disabilities, this stuff was started to be established in the 1930s. And this made like state and federal vocational rehabilitation programs permanent. It also broadened the scope of who could be served at these services and administrations, right? So it was no longer just soldiers, but people with different intellectual and developmental disabilities were also beginning to be included, right? And this idea of Social Security disability came into play here. This idea of SSDI, SSI, right? Different ways to get money to people living with disabilities were all established during this time. Next, we jump all the way to 1973 in the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So there's a lot that goes into the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and I won't jump ahead then. But something that's important to note that this idea of Section 504 is probably the most famous thing to come out of this like piece of legislation. Um, but we'll get there in time. So there were a lot of things that went along with this act. There was the idea that, people who went to vocational rehabilitation, administrations needed to have individually written rehabilitation programs, right? So they needed to have unique plans for how they could reintegrate into the workplace. It also really kind of stressed the idea that people with disabilities needed to be involved in the planning and evaluation of vocational rehabilitation services. And this was the idea of a more client-centered approach, really being adopted nationwide. And now we can talk a little bit about sections 503 and 504. So basically, the important thing to take away here is the idea that discrimination against individuals with disabilities was officially outlawed at this point. And if different companies, if different schools, if different local agencies did not abide by this, they would lose federal funding, right? So they would lose access to money. And that's one of the most powerful motivators that the United States has, right? Cutting off the faucet of cash. So this really um, kind of changed the landscape kind of forever when it came to the experience of people living with disabilities. Um, and it kind of legitimized this idea that, different accessibility devices are necessary for navigation versus kind of optional benefits that employers could refuse. Right. So this was the idea that if you were going to receive money from the federal government, you basically needed to stop discriminating. Let me go back. And the reason I mentioned 504 plans is oftentimes like students in high school, sometimes students in college, even who come to places like student disability resources, they'll, in high school, they might get something called a 504 plan. And this is where students with disabilities, right, who aren't getting equitable access to their schools, a plan will be made for them to be able to have kind of this agreement, right, for how they can better navigate the university environment or better navigate typically high school, middle school, or elementary school environments. Right. So now we're up to not quite modern day, but this is probably the most recent and most impactful piece of legislation we'll be covering today. And that's the Americans with Disabilities Act. So essentially, and this is where, like, let's say if you broke your leg tomorrow, knock on wood that that doesn't happen. But basically, if you acquired a temporary disability of any kind, you would fall under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And you would have the ability to go to student disability resources here on campus, and you would be entitled to certain what we call reasonable accommodations, or typically called academic accommodations in the university space. But this is the idea that people should not be barred from access to any institution actually in the United States on the basis of a disability, right? So maybe if you had a broken leg, you would be allowed to be tardy to class, right? Because it might take you extra time to get there. And that's an unfair burden given the fact that your mobility is bad. So this is the idea that, employers have to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified individuals with disabilities, unless doing so would cause like an undue hardship. So prior to the ADA, eligibility for different vocational rehabilitation services was pretty narrowly defined. And the ability for like interagency collaboration really expanded under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So this is where, for instance, students here at the university, they might have like a relationship with vocational rehabilitation and with student disability resources, on campus, right? This idea of different agencies that are serving people with disabilities should have some line of communication. They should function together to make sure people with disabilities are getting kind of the full suite of support that they should be entitled to. This was also kind of the first time in history where like Congress, like the government officially recognized the fact that individuals with disabilities had been subjected to discrimination. So this is one of the most, widespread and comprehensive pieces of civil rights legislation ever. Um, and Congress acknowledged that, people with disabilities didn't have options, within the laws to challenge different experiences of discrimination, unlike other kind of minority groups. So, this is kind of the most recognizable provision of the ADA in that it prohibits discrimination of individuals who live with disabilities in all aspects of employment. It requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to any employee with a disability. And this extends to students in the university space as well. Now, of course, it's important that, people meet the definition of a disability, as well as this idea of being a qualified individual with a disability in order to receive workplace accommodations. So this is the idea that basically we don't hire people with disabilities as tokens, right? You still hire someone who's qualified to complete a job. They just might need, accessible parking, right? Or different accessibility devices to navigate their workspace, right? So it's also important to note that a reasonable accommodation is a modification or adjustment to a job or the work environment, or potentially to the way things are usually done that enables a qualified individual with a disability to enjoy employment opportunities. So this is where potentially an easy one would be, let's say an employer always has meetings in person on the 10th floor. Well, this is where someone who might have a mobility challenge is given access to use Zoom, and they Zoom into the meeting room in order to make it a more equitable meeting space for them. So employers cannot deny employment to qualified applicants with disabilities because of the reasonable accommodation process. And they're also required to provide these accommodations to any and all aspects of the job, right? So basically, you can't not hire someone because they have a disability. Now, typically, this can be challenging to prove, in the court of law, as you might imagine, because employers still have the ability to say there's any number of reasons why someone isn't hired, but there's still this explicit protection that never existed before. All right. So now we'll do another brief little check-in. This one might be a little bit challenging. Um, just to be honest. Which law established state federal vocational rehabilitation programs as permanent? So then just a nice true or false. The Rehabilitation Act, Section 504, prohibits discrimination against people living with disabilities. All right. So, and then one quick fill in the blank. Reasonable accommodations are now available to people living with disabilities thanks to what law?